Next up, we have a distinguished group of panelists that will take us on a complex topic of conservation policy and sustainability. It is my pleasure to welcome the National Association of Farm Broadcasters President, Tom Cassidy, to the stage. Tom, the floor is yours.
Well, I'd like to have the rest of the panelists come up and join me. I don't want to spend a lot of time on introductions. I think most of you are familiar with who it is that we've got up here. So rather than have a big pedigree reading contest, I think we'd be better off to spend the next 40 minutes actually talking about policy ideas and the different opportunities that we have here. I'm Tom Cassidy. I'm the farm broadcaster of the Ag Radio Network. Our network covers the Northeast. I'm in New York, Vermont, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware. I've got a couple of stations in Virginia. So I'm pretty much the farm broadcaster in the Northeast. That's not bragging, I'm the only one. So I'd like to have the rest of the panel in here, and we'll start right out talking about, we've got Daniel Wrinn. He's the National Government Affairs Director. You want to just give a little wave. Rod Snyder, with Ducks Unlimited. Rod Snyder is the President of Field to Market. Joel Pederson is the Director of Government Affairs for the National Wild Turkey Federation. And Pelham Straughn is a partner in the 9B group. Why don't we take maybe 3-4 minutes and talk about a little bit about yourself and what your organization is working on, and then we can jump right into some farm policy issues.
Sure, do you want me to start?
Sure.
So for folks that aren't familiar, Ducks Unlimited is a national organization. For the most part, we are duck hunters. We're not entirely all duck hunters, but most of us come to DU with a background in waterfowling. We were started in 1937 during the Dust Bowl days, and there was a group of concerned waterfowl hunters that were looking at the landscape, and in the fall they just weren't seeing birds come down where they normally would see them. And that's what started it all, a handful of very passionate waterfowlers. Fast forward to now, DU has an annual budget of around $200 million. We have close to 300 staff across the country. We have a sister organization in Canada, as well as Mexico. We hold lots of events. We raise money around the country, upwards of 3,500 events. We've got over 700,000 members now in every state. If you see the duck head on back of a pickup truck in your local county, that's probably someone who's been to one of our dinners. Some of you have probably been to some of our dinners. I came to DU as an intern originally in 1993. I was a senior at the University of Connecticut. Came down, did a summer internship with my then girlfriend, now wife. How she's managed to stay with me that long, I have no clue. But we did internships in DC, and it changed my life. I've been down in DC, not working the entire time for DU, but on and off, basically since we moved down there full time in 1996. Real quick, farm bills are extremely important, obviously, to wetlands and waterfowl management. When you look at the landscape and the majority of the land is farmed and ranched in this country, you are not going to be able to impact continental migratory bird populations without being able to work with producers across the landscape. So DU started working on farm bills as early as 1990, and we had a lot of work on the last one, and look forward to working with you all on the next one.
Good morning. Again, Joel Pederson, Director of Government Affairs with the National Wild Turkey Federation. Like Dan explained, with Ducks Unlimited, the National Wild Turkey Federation got its start from a bunch of turkey hunters that were not seeing turkeys on the landscape in the early 1970s. So we're much younger than DU, but a very similar model. We've got about 1,700 chapters across the nation. about 230,000 members, and we do a lot of work on the ground, both through fundraising and conservation delivery. We've delivered more than 17 million acres of conservation on the ground locally on both public land and private lands throughout the history of our organization. Like Dan said, with the Farm Bill, it's extremely important to conservation for the National Wild Turkey Federation and for all of you. A lot of the work that we do is delivery in those local communities. We've got about 60 conservation staff across the country that works on projects with national forests, fish and wildlife refuges, but also with private landowners. We've got a long partnership with the NRCS and by extension with the conservation districts to put that private conservation on the ground. We've got about a dozen foresters that work in local communities, working with those private landowners, those producers to do that good conservation. And a couple of examples where we're working directly with the conservation districts. The Crook County Conservation District in Wyoming and the Custer County Conservation District in South Dakota have helped us to fund a couple of those positions that are putting the Farm Bill programs, the working lands programs, on the ground there in the Black Hills area. So when the NWTF thinks about Farm Bill, for us, it's really about the forestry aspect, the working lands programs, equip good CRP acres that have to do with forestry in the right places, as well as the voluntary public access program to get those folks, allow our members and others to get out on the ground to enjoy the resources that we're benefiting out there. So the NWTF was part of the Forest and the Farm Bill Coalition, along with several other groups. We were on the steering committee. NACD has signed on to that platform, and so we're really focusing our efforts as we move forward in this Farm Bill in that area.
Good morning. My name is Rod Snyder. I'm president of Field to Market, the Alliance for Sustainable Agriculture. We're a little bit of a newer organization, only been around about 10 years, but we're a multi-stakeholder alliance of more than 130 companies and organizations that span the food and ag supply chain, working on sustainability outcomes within U.S. agriculture. So our membership ranges from grower organizations all the way through to downstream food and retail companies like Walmart and McDonald's and a few other little companies you've heard of. NACD is actually also a member, and NRCS has been involved for a long time. 10 years ago when we got started, it was under this notion that as consumers began to pay a lot more attention to where and how their food was grown, we really needed to get the full agriculture sector involved in how we define and measure and advance sustainability outcomes and connect that story back to consumers in a way that was very science-based, practical, and a way that actually helped support growers. And that's really the mission of our organization. We actually don't do any policy work. I chuckled a little when I got invited to a Farm Bill panel, but I think there's a reason for that, and that's because as more and more food companies begin to look at environmental impacts of their supply chain, including back at the farm level, they're very interested in what the policy mechanisms and the other kinds of drivers that can actually help support farmers and advance conservation outcomes that their consumers really care about. And so this topic is maybe not as direct to Field to Market, but for our companies, they're paying close attention to this work.
My name, again, is Pelham Straughn, and I wanted to give you a little bit of a background about myself. I started on the Hill in 1997, spent my entire adult life working on farm bills. I spent nearly 15 years working on the House Committee on Agriculture. I had the portfolio of conservation for nearly 8 years. I'll tell you a funny story, how life can kind of come in the middle of these things. I planned to get married in 2011. That went very smoothly before the Farm Bill cycle. My wife and I, who also worked on the Agriculture Committee, talked about, well, we need to have our first child after the Farm Bill. And that Farm Bill was going to be wrapped up by 2012. Well, that didn't happen. And as life just has a funny way of doing it, we had our first child right in the middle of the Farm Bill debate. That was a very tiring time, but also both my wife and I love working on farm bills. It's in our blood. After the 2014 Farm Bill was passed into law and signed by the President, about a year later, my partner and I, Dave White, former chief of NRCS, formed the 9B group. Our goal is to specifically work with groups who care about conservation. We're not like other lobbying shops that might have commodity clients or whatever it might be. We are solely working on conservation, and I think that gives us a focus that really helps our clients. We have diversified clients. We have the National Association of Conservation Districts as one of our clients. We have the American Water Works Association, who's really getting into conservation in this collaborative model of working together to solve water quality programs. So I'm really excited. I really like to say that I live and die on farm bills. This has been my adult life, is working on farm bills, so I'm really happy to talk about on this panel.
Great. Now, we probably don't need to go into details about the challenges to conservation. The audience pretty much knows about that. But can you give us an example of one big challenge that you see, and then some of the opportunities for solving that?
I would say that having worked on several farm bills and as we move into the future and we put this one together, it's becoming increasingly clear that farmers and ranchers, the demand to do conservation far exceeds the ability to deliver it through a farm bill that is adequately funded. Obviously you do, and I'm sure this group knows it better than most, you do the best you can with what you have. And you know, that's a tough standard to live by. It's tiring and it gets frustrating, but I think this farm bill will reflect some of those same pressures. There's always the ability to do more, but we are restricted by our ability to have funding that meets all of those demands. And it's important to highlight that those demands aren't coming from the folks that are delivering the programs. They're coming from the producers. They're coming from the farmers and ranchers that want to implement these practices, and they need that help, whether it's through NRCS, NACD, you know, National Wild Turkey Federation. But that is a stress that is going to be pervasive as we put this farm bill together.
Money's always the issue. We all know that. I think one of the challenges that we need to address here, and one of the things that we need to focus on moving forward, is the breadth of benefits that we get out of the Farm Bill. It's very easy for me, working for the National Wild Turkey Federation, to focus on the benefits to turkeys and deer and those other critters, but there's a lot more benefits out there, and I think that the NWTF and the other groups that are involved need to do a good job of focusing as well on the water quality, the soil health, and all of those other issues. And getting that community buy-in, as Dr. Clovis mentioned, the local benefits that people get, I think that's an important message that we need to continue to deliver.
Well, probably no surprise, my comment is also around money. We're in a price-constrained environment right now in the U.S. ag system in general, and so there's not a lot of extra money laying around on the table, even within farmers' own pockets, to be able to take risks or adopt new practices. And so it makes these programs even more critical at this moment in time. But the other thing I would say, I think one of the big challenges and opportunities is that within the budget discussions in Washington, D.C., I think there's going to be increasing pressure on how we defend these programs in a science-based way. What are the actual benefits that we're going to be achieving as a result of the programs, and doing a better job of demonstrating that. I think NRCS in recent years has really turned a lot of its attention to be able to actually use data to measure and demonstrate the benefit that we get from the conservation programs. That's only going to increase moving forward. I would say from the supply chains perspective, this is also really of interest. A lot of the food companies are wanting to understand the actual environmental benefits and impacts of certain practices that farmers are adopting. So the better that we we can do to collect that data, to measure and demonstrate, I think we can all defend these programs in a more robust way.
No, I hate to kind of echo what my colleagues have said here, but I think it's really important two things. One is, can we tell our story better? We have, for, say, the past 10 or 15 years, told our story through acres of how many acres we've gotten, how much money we have spent. But I think it's really important to say, well, how many pounds of nitrogen, how many birds that we have gotten on the landscape. We need to tell that story better to an audience that may not understand that what $6 billion a year means for conservation. What Dan talked about funding, and it's about capacity. The fact that we have farmers that voluntarily want to do things on their farm, especially with EQIP, where it's cost share, where they have to put up their own money. The fact that we don't have the money to say, yes, come on in, but we're turning people away is really sad. Also, I think the capacity, the technical capacity of, if a farmer wants a conservation plan, he's got to wait a year for that. That's bad. That's sad. I think we really need to look at how we can better target our funds and have more technical capacity to deliver these funds.
A lot of conservation practices, most of them are public-private partnerships. So what are some of the things we can do, because now you're not just talking about one entity, several, to coordinate that effort for communication?
I would say in terms of delivering Farm Bill type programs, you're looking at, they're almost entirely delivered, at least from our perspective, from wildlife perspective, as a public-private partnership. I mean, you have groups like DU that provide matching funds to these, to a lot of these projects, or work with NRCS in terms of delivering them, or work with NACD. So these partnerships have already been there. It was mentioned earlier that we have to do a better way of communicating them, and I think we all have to do a better job at that. But I think if you look at the history of a lot of Title II type programs, the public-private partnerships are already there. And fact of the matter is we're really good at it. We are able to take limited funds, work with partners, bring in diverse partners. If you look at from the last Farm Bill, and Pelham can speak to this, you look at the Regional Conservation RCPP program, which basically prioritized certain areas and certain practices around the country. If you look at the diverse partnerships that were built as a result of that innovation in the Farm Bill, it's been incredible. It's stretched dollars. It's brought new folks into conservation that weren't doing it last time. So I think from my perspective, we just have to do more of it. I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel entirely too much.
Can I piggyback on that? I think the RCPP is actually a really exciting example, and actually a lot of credit to ducks, quite frankly. Within the Field to Market umbrella, a number of food companies who for the first time are paying attention to on-farm conservation. It's pretty new if you look in the entire history of this work. They said, well, what is the best way that we can invest and roll up our sleeves and bring resources to the table? And so Ducks Unlimited put together several RCPP projects that included major food manufacturers in the local project, bringing resources to the table to help support growers. And we need to see more of that, not less. And I think it opens up a whole new range of opportunities that didn't exist before. So I would second that, and I would also commend groups like Ducks Unlimited for actually helping to assemble those diverse coalitions that can help deliver these results.
Yeah, I think it's critical to bring these new partnerships, but we also can't forget about what we have on the ground now. NRCS, thousands of employees in the field, 2,800 field offices that have a reach into almost every rural community. On top of that, we have 3,000 conservation districts that are the backbone of our delivery system. And so how do we mesh those new partnerships with what we already have on the ground is going to be something that we need to really look at as RCPP grows and those types of partnership grow.
Most of the funds are put towards implementation of programs. Would there be any benefits to incentivizing results?
So pay for performance, those types of things, I think are the ultimate goal. So, you know, you look back and we have come so far. The conservation title, the first conservation title in the Farm Bill was in 1985. We had CRP was authorized in that program. And so I think for the first 20 or 25 years of this conservation involvement, we were talking about, let's just put as much conservation on the ground as we possibly could. It didn't really matter where, it didn't really matter you know, how we did it. Let's get as much on the ground. I think as we move forward, there are two things that we're gonna really need to start working on. One is prioritizing where we put conservation to actually solve natural resource concerns. And then Dr. Clovis talked about is precision agriculture. And that precision agriculture lets us not just treat the whole field as if it's the same, but really treat areas that need to be treated. And along with that is using data to focus on practices that have the most environmental bang for the buck.
I agree with that. I think paying for the performance and the results really is where we want to go, but it's a pretty difficult place to get. NRCS has done a great job in the past of collecting the data so that we know what practices to put on the ground and know what we can expect from them. I think one of the focuses we need to have in this Farm Bill is continuing to think about that. How do we do the monitoring? How do we gain the information that we need so that we can make it better, make the best use of limited funds going forward?
Yeah, and Field to Market certainly doesn't have any position on pay for performance, but I would say from our perspective, what's really interesting about this conversation is that within a number of supply chains now, let's just take General Mills sourcing wheat for Wheaties as an example. They're looking now at how they actually measure environmental impacts within their supply chain as precisely and specifically as possible. A good bit of that work stems back from NRCS tools and models that the public sector has invested in over the years. And so what I would say is let's continue to at least make sure we have the tools available and the data available to best understand these impacts. How you structure the conservation programs is another conversation, but as a foundation, let's make sure we have these technical tools accessible because the public is looking for that now. Food companies are looking for that now. We all want to be able to demonstrate this as accurately as possible and also help move farmers towards practices that are really going to work.
I think it's important that one of those metrics, and it's a little trickier with wildlife on how to measure that in terms of, in relation to a conservation practice, and I think wildlife is a good indicator to have. I think back to the Deep Horizon oil spill and how if you look at, from a wildlife perspective, you look at what NRCS led with its partners at NACD and DU and others in parts of Louisiana with the Migratory Bird Habitat Initiative. And producers responded, they flooded fields, they manipulated fields because we weren't sure what was going to happen with 9 million birds coming down to winter in the Gulf Coast. And thank God there were some very smart folks that were actually taking pictures and videotaping what exactly was being done to the land, farmers out there flooding fields, putting water back on, and the response from wildlife was incredible. The calories that birds needed, the loafing areas that they needed in the winter were largely provided by private landowners. Rice producers were the main target of it, and I can't quite recall how many acres they did, but the numbers of birds that utilized those acres was incredible, and really made a huge difference in how we mitigated a potentially bad situation. And I think those metrics also need to be accounted for when looking at measuring how well conservation practices are impacting wildlife as well.
So you talked about the fact that these were farmers, private landowners. So we're back to private land ownership. We're talking about voluntary practices and locally led, although there was expertise from further up. What kind of things, Dr. Clovis mentioned this in response to a question, that there's some criticism about these voluntary, locally led programs. What kind of things would you suggest for the members to go back to combat that? How would they stress that the locally led voluntary programs are the most beneficial?
I would say part of it is largely an education process, and Dr. Clovis mentioned that. I think most of the communities that we work in when we implement these programs, more rural communities, they understand it. There is not a question about what that buffer strip or what that restored wetland, what it's doing to the landscape and why a producer voluntarily did it. I think there's a chasm between those areas and then the larger urban areas that don't have as close a relationship with what we all do. And you know, it's tough to close that, but I do think that as you know, consumers want to know more about how food is produced and how it is sustainable, I think that's kind of where, you know, I look at the whole sustainability question, bridging that chasm, because they're going to learn more about what wetlands do on the landscape and what buffer strips do and what tree plantings do and all those things, which leads them to form an opinion about what foods they will buy and what they will purchase. So in my mind, it's an education process.
You know, regulation is a one-size-fits-all solution. The great thing about voluntary incentive-based conservation is through NRCS and through the conservation districts, people can come onto your farm and tailor your conservation plan or practices to your needs, to your individual farm. And so if you look at regulations that might be regional or state or nationwide, they can't address a producer's overall and individual needs, and that's really important. The fact is that when we deal with voluntary incentive-based conservation, you have people coming to NRCS for solutions instead of saying, no, don't come on the farm, I don't want you there. That's an amazing thing for district officials and for NRCS, is that they're invited on the farm, and that only occurs because it's voluntary and incentive-based.
I think building on that, it's often proactive as well. They can see what's going to happen, what the concerns are going to be, and it's proactive, so it's more cost effective because you can get in front of the issue. It's not trying to save the sage grouse after we've already had lots of impacts on it. It's being proactive to make sure that we don't have to list a species and then spend the money trying to recover it under regulation. I think that's a really important piece as well that people need to understand.
Yeah, and just simply compare, as you just mentioned it, but comparing the cost of regulation versus the cost of the investments in voluntary conservation. I'm sure this analysis has been done many times before, but regulatory systems, generally speaking, are more expensive in terms of the benefit that they actually provide. And so as long as that education exists and we're able to actually get out to the public to talk about the benefit of it, I think it is a really defensible place for this industry to be. And I would, again, encourage all of agriculture to figure out how we partner with consumer-facing brands to talk about the benefits of the voluntary conservation work that growers are doing on the land. I think about right now, Unilever is in a major project in Iowa around cover crop adoption. They're actually helping to pay for cost share cover crops in Iowa around water quality issues. They can then go out and actually tell their consumers who are buying mayonnaise about stories around what farmers are doing on the land. We need to figure out how we partner with folks that actually can get back to the consumer, because we talk about it all the time, it's cliche at this point, but most of America is far removed from farm country at this point, multiple generations removed. We are going to have to work with non-traditional partners to be actually get into the living rooms and kitchens of folks to help them understand what makes a difference and what doesn't.
Now, Rod, you mentioned it, and you're part of a coalition of folks who aren't typically your traditional conservationists, but this has become of more interest to the consumers as a whole. What kind of suggestions do you have for bringing those folks in?
Well, what's interesting about these groups of companies that are beginning to get involved, the first thing is that they noticed that they needed to take a leadership role. Perhaps it was some shareholders or NGOs that were telling them to look at this, whatever the reason is, the motivation, but they got here to the point where they wanted to work with growers. And they started to set targets, whether it was around water use. Coca-Cola has a major water use goal by 2020. Some of them are around greenhouse gas emissions, some of them are focused on soil, but they began to set very public targets about the kind of benefits they want to drive in their supply chain. What I think they didn't always do at the front end is determine how they were going to get there. And so now there's a major opportunity for all of us that have worked in conservation for a long time in U.S. agriculture to come alongside these companies and figure out the best ways to help them achieve these public targets that they have set. And so when I think about the role of conservation districts and NRCS and others who are on the ground, let's face it, Walmart doesn't have relationships with farmers, other than the fact that they're customers in their stores, but they certainly don't know anything about farming. The folks that do are in this room. And so how can local NRCS offices, conservation districts, local NGOs actually help bring the growers along through the existing relationships to deliver the outcomes that these major food companies are looking to achieve? There's really no other way that they're going to get there. The public targets are important, they're good, but that's not ultimately what's going to deliver the improved environmental outcomes.
I think one thing, and we saw it in the last Farm Bill, I'm going to give a really big compliment to Dan over there, is how do we get more and diverse groups interested in the conservation title? And we did that last Farm Bill by getting the crop insurance companies involved in the conservation title by linking conservation compliance with crop insurance. And so we had this huge group of people now advocating for the conservation title, which was the crop insurance companies. We also need to tell our story better and maybe in a different way. One of the things that I've seen in this Farm Bill process is water utilities being more interested in the conservation programs and how conservation practices on the ground and upstream can help these problems with treating water. So bringing that health benefit in. Conservation programs help with healthy drinking water. That's not a message that you hear a lot, but it's certainly something that brings in millions of other people. These programs and practices on the ground in certain areas, protecting sources of drinking water is vitally important. And so if you want healthy drinking water throughout this country, you need to invest in the conservation title.
So rural America is fairly independent. We're talking about policy issues. What kind of conservation initiatives are happening in the private sector that aren't necessarily policy-based?
I could start. One good example within Field to Market, over the last number of years, we've established something we called field print projects. And in short, basically this means that a food company will identify where they're sourcing their crop. They may actually not even know that at first because it goes through a long chain by the time it gets processed into whatever product it is. But they determine that region and they go back and they begin working with farmers on measuring impacts around water quality, soil erosion, greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, et cetera. And then aggregate and roll that information up to be able to tell their consumers how they're doing. But along the way, these initiatives always involve a local partner that actually helps to convene the growers. And they do peer-to-peer benchmarking. They'll actually, if growers volunteer to do so, they'll anonymously share data and information around how they're performing so that they can then look and see opportunities for improvement. This is not directly in the policy realm, but it's happening alongside this entire conversation. And so how can we encourage this kind of work and support it at the same time that we're doing the traditional Farm Bill programs? How can we actually support and bring along food companies to work in tandem? I like to remind the food companies that they may have showed up in the last few years, but farmers have been working on conservation for a century. Let's not lose sight of the fact they're not operating in a vacuum here. They're building on top of a long history of good voluntary conservation work. Let's figure out how we bring these things together.
So I'm going to read this because I want to make sure I get it right. NACD and the American Farmland Trust released a report recently on the role of environmental markets for conservation districts. Do you think there's a role for environmental markets in the Farm Bill?
Yeah, this is a question that we actually struggled with in 2008 and 2014. In some ways, to have environmental markets, the best way to do it is to have regulation, and so then you're selling credits to help farmers comply. We certainly don't want to do that through the Farm Bill. I think environmental markets honestly are a private sector vehicle, and I think in some ways government needs to just kind of step back and get out of the way. I think we're probably a number of years or a number of Farm Bill cycles from actually having language in the Farm Bill that would dictate a market or help it come into fruition.
Well, I think we could open it up to questions. If we've got, there's a couple of microphones out there. If anybody's got questions for the panelists. Stand up and raise your hand. I can't imagine that there isn't a single question.
My name is Bruce Snow from Central Delaware. I'm a supervisor of my local conservation district. And, there's a lot of things. I laugh because you mentioned when you were going to have your first child before the Farm Bill is done. And do the conservation programs slow up the delivery of the Farm Bills? Or are you guys important on having us out there? Conservation's changing just like everything else. And it's important to the landowners to know that we're going to have, this is supposed to be kind of a Farm Bill discussion, that we're going to have one on time. It just seems that our government just keeps putting things off. And, how important is that to you partners to get us, let us know what's going on in a timely fashion? Thank you.
Yeah, so the general wisdom is that Washington can't do anything on time, and we have seen that with the last two Farm Bills, both to the 2008 Farm Bill and the 2014 Farm Bill had multiple extensions. I think you look back, in 2014 was a little bit different situation. We had high prices, commodity prices, record high net farm income in 2012 and 2013. We had direct payments that were there that with extensions would continue. And we heard a lot of people say we couldn't get the groundswell of support for a new farm bill because things were doing well in farm country at that time. Now, compare that to now. We have very low prices. We have two commodity programs, both dairy and cotton, that are felt to be not a good safety net for those programs, so they need to be changed. We have, again, this idea that we need to be fiscally disciplined. And so you have all of these things that are kind of working against having a farm bill on time. What counters that is, I think, some of the sheer will of the people who care about this in Washington. Those of us on the stage, the National Association of Conservation Districts, and members on the Hill. You look at Chairman Conaway, the chairman of the House Committee on Agriculture, he's done his homework. He spent the last year having literally dozens of hearings, hearing from, National Association of Conservation Districts, Ducks Unlimited, all testified at these hearings, and so they've done their homework. They want to do it, but Washington works slow. The things that we have to get done in the next couple of months is staggering. We have an appropriation bill from last year that hasn't been done. We have to do an FY19 appropriation bill. There is a disaster bill that has significant money for conservation programs like the Emergency Conservation Fund, the Emergency Watershed Program, that are all stacking up. So there are certainly people working hard to get a farm bill on time, but they are difficult to do, no doubt.
Yeah, we certainly go to our office every morning and work under the assumption that the farm bill's process is going to happen on time. That's the only way you can do it, because there's no sunken costs in putting together your priorities, talking to members of Congress and their staff, because if you do end up in a situation where you do get an extension, that all rolls over, and then you continue the work, and that's what we've done the last couple of farm bills. But the assumption that I'm under and our staff is this will be done on time.
My experience, 20 years of covering policy issues in agriculture, would say that conservation is probably one of the least controversial areas of the Farm Bill. During the last Farm Bill process, Rep. Lucas was the chairman, and he would always say, my friends on the left don't want to spend any money in the city or in the country, and my friends on the right don't want to spend any money anywhere. And then Colin Pederson would laugh, and then they would just express their frustration that here they were pretty much had everything worked out, and we were still going to wait another year in order to get it done, correct?
Yeah, I think the conservation title is not necessarily the driver of farm bills, but on the other hand, it never, ever is one that holds a farm bill back. You talk about the bipartisanship, and that naturally happens in the agriculture committees, but it is even more so in the conservation title. We worked as a team. We had this crazy process called the super committee process that hopefully you know nothing about, but we sat together as the four principal staffs and wrote a farm bill together. That certainly helped, and it was a bipartisan process. So conservation may not be the one that drags the farm bill across the line, but it's one of those that does bring a diverse coalition into supporting farm bills.
Do we have another question?
Yes, Steve Stierwald from Illinois. Many of us here are representing individual soil and water conservation districts, resource districts, but individuals out all across the country. And how do we, as we have NRC, or we have our national organizations helping us, but it's so often, I think, what can local people do to help advocate for the technical assistance that NRCS provides for us, and what can we in the local areas do to advocate for this conservation effort that we so badly need in the Farm Bill?
I mean, I can tell you what we do, at least through DU and our chapters. As I said before, we have close to 700,000 members, and we have chapters in every county and in most towns across the country. And we'll talk to our members, and we'll have them call their local congressional offices, and some will go set up meetings and sit down with local congressional staff. But you know, we've made a strategic effort to sort of decentralize as much as we can our advocacy efforts with members of Congress. So if you've got a local chapter in, you know, Everly, Iowa, it's a place where I go pheasant hunting every year. I've got family friends out there. I have the local DU chapter folks, you know, call the local office of their member of Congress, Steve King, and talk to him about, you know, what they think is important for duck hunters and pheasant hunters in Clay County. You would be surprised at how responsive most members of Congress are when those calls and even a higher degree, those meetings occur back in the state, back in the local office, not as orchestrated as DC meetings tend to be, which are also important. We also have fly-ins, but that tends to resonate more, I think, in our experiences over at least the evolution of farm bills, at least over the last 5 years. You know, there's local delivery of conservation programs, which is the only way to do it, and I think dovetailing into that is local advocacy for conservation programs.
I would say go to town halls, go to the members' town halls. So they are getting screamed at about health care and immigration and tax reform. Standing up there and talking about voluntary incentive-based conservation and how that helps the land and the communities, they'll be like, whew, yeah, I want to talk about that, thank God. So it's really important, though, that they hear that local voice. You know, Dan and all of us up here go to, maybe not you, Rod, since you can't advocate on policy, but we go to offices and we tell these stories. But having someone, an actual constituent, an actual person who can vote for that member, it's extremely important to go and meet them, whether it's at their local office or a town hall.
I'd take it one step further as well and say get them out on the ground and let them see the work that's being done so that they can see the benefits firsthand. And it doesn't always have to be the member either. Even those local staffers, if they have a better understanding, they're well listened to as well.
In a past life, I worked at the National Corn Growers and actually did conservation policy for the corn growers. And of course, big corn was always known for its influence in Washington, and you know, for better or for worse. But there really wasn't any particular magic to it. It was the fact that folks on the ground, farmers across the country, were extremely energized and mobilized to reach out to their policymakers, and they were intentional about it. They made a point to do it both in DC but also in the district offices. Lots of farm visits and field visits. It was remarkable to see just local folks around the country, farmers, realizing that they had, I mean, it's democracy in action. They had the ability to actually impact the outcome of the Farm Bill if they took the time to weigh in. And yeah, it sounds sort of oversimplified or cliche, but it actually makes a tremendous difference.
We've just got a couple of minutes left. You want to each of you talk about your number one priority and what you'd like to see.
You know, as Dr. Clovis said earlier in his remarks, the last Farm Bill was pretty good, and I don't see, and I'm sure I'm going to get mugged leaving here because everyone's got problems, I know, but like, at a macro level, it was a pretty good bill and addressed a lot of issues. Most of DU's priorities are reflected in the last Farm Bill, retaining conservation compliance and crop insurance. We think, as was alluded to before, that was a partnership with producers, with the commodity groups, and the conservation community. And we think that needs to be maintained and maybe even improved upon. We want to make sure Title II is adequately funded. Easement programs especially are important to us. And then, you know, RCPP needs to be funded adequately. It has really driven some innovative work on the landscape. And then finally, I'd say water, water, water. If you look across the country and you look at the stressors on agriculture and conservation, 9 times out of 10 it has to do with water quantity and water quality. As a community, we have to get our heads wrapped around this. It's been a growing problem, and it's a tough one, but those chickens are going to come home to roost, and it's going to affect producers, it's going to affect conservation, it's going to affect everybody.
I would agree with the RCPP part of that. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, the forestry programs that are contained within the Farm Bill are very important to us, so we're really focused on those aspects and the working lands programs that we've seen a lot of benefit from.
For me, I think I wake up every day thinking about and worried about overall trust in our food system. It's eroded over time. Consumers look at these issues a little differently than they used to. And so what can we all do, both from a public sector and private sector perspective, to build confidence, to rebuild confidence in our food system? Clearly, a critical piece of that is the conservation programs within the Farm Bill. Increasingly, that also includes the involvement of food companies and private sector entities as well. But I think at the end of the day, one key principle we all should keep focused on is how can all of this help build confidence in the food system and be translated to consumers that ultimately are the ones that are going to make a lot of decisions in this space.
I think for the general conservation community, the number one thing is to maintain conservation title funding. We were part of the solution last time by having $6 billion in cuts to the conservation title. I think we've cut about as much as we can, so maintaining conservation title funding. And then emphasizing working lands. I mean, we want producers to be producing on the most prime farmland and helping them do that. So focus on working lands as part of that as well.
All right, I'd like to thank our panelists here. Thanks for your time. Pleasure. Okay.
Thank you again to our moderator, Tom Cassidy, and our panelists from Ducks Unlimited, National Wild Turkey Federation, Field to Market, and 9B. Let's give Tom and our panelists another round, please.